So I watched the new film, Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. This film is loosely based on the true story of Operation Postmaster in World War II, where a group of men is tasked with this undercover mission of destroying a Nazi ship. I think Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare is a pretty cool name, but it is a tongue twister, so I'll be referring to it as Ministry from now on. Now, getting straight into my opinions, I thought it was a decent action flick. I had a good time watching it, but I don't think it's really anything particularly special or memorable. Across the board, it doesn't have much of a personality. It also doesn't really have anything deep about it, but it's obviously not trying to be deep. Even by action movie standards, though, I think Ministry is quite simplistic and shallow. I hesitate to say that I had a great time watching this or that it was super entertaining for me, but I think a lot of people will probably have a really good time watching this. For the most part, I do think the film is cleanly made. I don't have much to complain about other than the writing, which is one of the most important things, but whatever. First off, I want to talk about the cast and the characters they play. And don't worry, I'm not going to get into spoilers in this video. This film has a pretty good cast. I wouldn't say it's objectively super stacked, but it's full of a lot of people I know, which always helps. So let's get into who's in this film and where they fit into the overall story. Henry Cavill is the main character and is by far the biggest A-lister in this cast. He's basically the squad leader of this group of ungentlemen. The group of ungentlemen is made up of Alan Ritchson, Alex Pettyfer, Hero Fiennes Tiffin, Henry Golding, Babs Olusan Macoun, and Isa Gonzalez. Carrie Elways plays the military leader of this operation, Rory Kinnear plays Winston Churchill, and Till Schweiger plays the Nazi villain. This cast isn't full of A-listers, and I don't know any of them as being these prestige Oscar-winning actors, but I think they had a lot of potential here. Unfortunately, I think they were supremely let down by the writing. I liked this film on a shallow, mindless level, but the weak writing prevented me from having any kind of deeper feelings. These characters aren't developed on any level. Ministry is almost like a real-world version of Suicide Squad. There's this extremely important mission that needs to be done, but it's so dangerous that it's basically a death wish, and the only ones desperate enough to attempt this mission are these wacky, crazy characters who have nothing to lose, and most of them happen to be in jail already. Ministry does market itself this way, too.
You won't like them. They're all... mad. They'll need to be.
The problem for me is that they're not mad enough. They definitely do have a tendency to disobey orders, but other than that, they're kind of just your typical action movie characters. Actually, disobeying orders is pretty normal for most action characters, so even that's not particularly unique. The characters have absolutely no personalities. Between the 7 ungentlemen, there's not really anything that distinguishes one from the next. Henry Cavill gets the most screen time out of all of them, but even his character doesn't really stand out. For me, the fun of something like Suicide Squad is seeing all of these unique characters and how they interact with each other. Not to say that Suicide Squad is the pinnacle of filmmaking, but the characters really do stand out and are the strongest thing about that film. I get that it's probably harder to do that in Ministry, where they don't have these cool superpowers that automatically sets them apart from each other, but there is a lot that can be done with the acting, styling, and costuming, but especially with each character's personality, backstory, and trajectory over the course of the film. To give the writers the benefit of the doubt, this is based on a true story, so maybe they didn't want to make caricatures out of these real-life people. The most I can say is that Babs and Isa's characters are a little different from the rest in that they're classier than the rest of the squad, but it's not too significant, and we still don't really get to know them very well at all. The essence of each character is pretty bare, but we also get close to nothing of backstory, development, or vulnerability from them. We get like 2 sentences about each character explained to us in an exposition dump, but other than that, I'm serious that we learn nothing else about most of them. I feel like even in most action movies, we still get to see a little bit of vulnerability in the characters. Even if it's cheesy or predictable, it still helps us feel closer to them and helps raise the stakes during fight scenes or in the climax, where we don't want to see something happen to these characters because we want to see them reunite with their grandmother in the end, something like that. There's no vulnerability, no development, which leads to it being a little boring because I don't care about the characters and the emotions are static the whole time. In terms of performances, we don't get to see any range from the actors, and in terms of story, we don't see anything but confidence from the characters, so it's pretty obvious how the story and mission is going to turn out. I've complained about the characters and writing for long enough. The cast does a pretty good job with the material that they're given. I do think they're pretty underutilized overall. Again, there's no vulnerability or depth at all, but the cast does a good job of playing these classic, confident action movie characters. They're comfortable and likable and fun to watch, particularly Henry, Isa, and Alan, but there aren't any particular weak spots out of the cast. Everyone looks pretty good, too. A few random notes about the cast. I was surprised to see Alex Pettyfer. I feel like he was in everything at one point and then he just disappeared out of nowhere. But I guess he's back now. I also wanted to point out that I just zeroed in on the fact that Hero Finds Tiffin has Fines in his name. Yes, he's one of those Fines. He is a Nepo baby, and I don't know how it took me so long to realize that. Anyway, Till Schweiger was great as the Nazi villain. He was very good at being cold and guarded, but I was especially blown away by those moments where his character flips a switch and becomes completely cold-blooded. It felt so authentic and terrifying, and I could feel his anger and disgust through the screen. Now, getting into some of the more behind-the-scenes details, I said earlier that this was based on a true story. It says this in the trailers, but I didn't really register that until I was actually watching the movie. I love it when films are based off of true stories, even if a lot of artistic license is used. I just love knowing that this fantastical, far-fetched thing that is supposed to only happen in the movies actually did happen in real life, even if it is heavily altered. I've never heard of this whole situation, but I think it's an interesting story, at least as it's told in the film. They say this historical event potentially inspired James Bond. Ministry is loosely based on Damian Lewis's nonfiction book called Churchill's Secret Warriors, the explosive true story of the Special Forces desperados of World War II. Another tongue twister. Every time something is based on a true story like this, it always makes me want to read the book, too. I try to watch all kinds of films, all kinds of genres, but I do like to unpack and analyze the genre labels assigned to these films. In this case, depending on where you look, this film is labeled as a few different things. Most places label this as an action and war movie, which is probably the best way you can ID this film. For an action film, though, I do think it's a little light on the action. There aren't too many big action scenes, and most of the fights are a little underwhelming in the way they're choreographed or shot, I think. There was one fight scene towards the end in the depths of a submarine that I really liked. I do also want to say that I'm not a big action film person, so I do always have to give props when I even somewhat like an action movie. Some sources call this film a comedy, drama, and/or spy film. I wouldn't really call it a spy movie, and it's pretty light on the comedy. I talked a lot about the writing earlier. Ministry had 3 writers, Paul Tomasi, Eric Johnson, and Arash Amel. My critiques about the writing have mostly been focused on the underdeveloped characters because that's the thing that annoys me the most. But I have to say that another weakness for me was the comedy. All of the jokes felt so played out. They were all jokes or stereotypes that I feel like I've seen a million times before. The comedy wasn't so bad that it felt cringy, but it just wasn't funny to me, really. But a lot of people around me were having a good old time, so it definitely depends on the person and your comedy preferences or how good of a sport you're willing to be. Other than the comedy, I think the plot is straightforward and simple, which again can be nice depending on your preference and your mood. I wouldn't say I prefer a simple plot, but as long as there's a story, I should be happy. Here, the story is simplistic and straightforward, but there is a journey. There's a clear mission with steps and roadblocks along the way. But again, the story doesn't hit as hard as it could have because of the weak character writing. Ministry is directed by Guy Ritchie. I'm not too familiar with his work. Out of his filmography, I've only seen Sherlock Holmes and Aladdin. Even just looking at these 3 films, I can see a pattern of solid but safe movies. As I said, the writing is my biggest problem with this film, which does fall on the writers, of course, but it's also Guy's responsibility to oversee the writers. But other than the writing, I do think the film is pretty clean. It looks good in many ways. The actors look good, the costumes look good, the sets look good. I never noticed any ugly CGI or visual effects, which is kind of rare these days. It's not really anything special to me, but I don't think it's trying to be. There are some issues, but overall I think it's pretty solid, which I do have some respect for. I don't know where else to put this discussion, but I have to talk about it. There's this one random scene towards the end with Isa Gonzalez that just goes off the rails. Why does she randomly just start singing like it's an episode of Riverdale? And how does she randomly have a new outfit? That's one of the messy scenes. She also dresses as Cleopatra for this costume party, and she's wearing like the most revealing dress I've ever seen someone attempt to say is 1940s appropriate. I mean, she looked stunning, but it was just so jarring when the rest of the film seemed to be pretty historically accurate and appropriate. I've probably beat to death the fact that this film is shallow, but I think it's going to be pretty hard for people to hate this movie for the simple fact that it's all about fucking up Nazis. Like, how could you hate that? It is nice to just see a simple story of good triumphing over evil. This might be weird, but I feel like this could be a lot of people's new comfort movie because it's just so easy to watch. Everyone looks good, the actors are beautiful and likable, the historical sets and costumes are nice to look at, and you can't help rooting for the main characters and their cause. Without saying too much, this film is very low stakes, which also makes it really easy to watch. There's a lot of well-deserved built-in hate for Nazis that the filmmakers don't need to do a lot of heavy lifting with establishing their characters and values, but I didn't like how much was left to our already established knowledge. I would prefer if they show us a little bit of why we hate them and why they're bad people. That way it's more cathartic when they're terrorized. This is just another way that the characters are completely undeveloped. I was expecting the film to be way more brutal than it is. It is rated R, so in the spectrum of things, most people would probably consider it gory and brutal, but I thought it was kind of tame. I think a lot of comparisons can be made to Tarantino, and specifically Inglourious Basterds. Not that Tarantino owns Nazi movies, but there were several things with the style and specific scenes or dialogue that really made Ministry feel like a lesser version of Inglourious Basterds. I don't know if I was expecting the brutality because of those comparisons to Tarantino, or if it was the trailers, or if I just wanted it to be more brutal because that's my personal preference, but either way, I was a little disappointed. And I'll tell you why I like the brutality. I think we all like to see bad things happen to bad people. I know it's more obvious, it's not as subtle, but I like to see a little bit of the brutality of the Nazis and then see that paid back tenfold by our protagonists. It's just more cathartic and enjoyable for me that way. And I love the comedic juxtaposition of that, where the action star says their little quip at the villain and then just really messes them up. Sorry to go back to the Tarantino comparison, but I was expecting something like the savage flamethrower scenes in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. These kinds of things do happen in Ministry to some extent. The main characters say their funny lines and then kill Nazis, but at a more toned down level. But there are pros and cons to this. Again, it's not my personal preference, but I think Ministry will be a lot more palatable to general audiences and also has that potential of being a good casual comfort watch because it is so toned down. But I also am probably really desensitized to these kinds of things. And those are my thoughts on Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Ultimately, it's not really anything special, but it's not trying to be. It's kind of bland and unoriginal, but at the same time, it's inoffensive and unproblematic. It's not deep, but sometimes it's nice to watch something that you don't have to think too much about. But at the end of the day, I had a decent time watching it, and I think a lot of people will have a really good time with this. That's it. Let me know what you thought of this film, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!